What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the prequel to the Omen that's coming out this weekend, and that movie is called The First Omen. Directed by Arkasha Stevenson, who wrote this film alongside a few others. This film stars people like Nell Free, Ralph Ineson, Maria Caballero, Charles Dance, Bill Nighy, and more. So it's finally time to talk about the prequel to The Omen, and for anybody who's unfamiliar with The Omen, it's an original film that came out in the 70s that centers on a young boy who is possessed by the devil, or is the Antichrist himself. It would end up spawning a few sequels as well as a remake that ended up coming out when I was in my early teenage years in 2006. So now after all these years, we're getting a prequel to the original film, not directly connected to the remake, and going into it I was pretty intrigued. When I saw the trailers, it seemed eerie and creepy, but I was a little concerned on whether or not it was going to feel like just another religious horror flick. And if you've seen the trailer, you know that a lot of it obviously has to do with the first Omen, having to do with the pregnancy of this Antichrist. And even though I haven't seen the film yet or reviewed it here on the channel, literally just about a month ago or some change, there was that movie Immaculate with Sydney Sweeney, so it kind of felt like those two films felt very similar coming around the same time, which is something we've seen in cinema before. So having gone in to see this movie without having seen Immaculate though, this was my first religious horror flick of the year, but was very reminiscent of so many others that I've seen in previous years, most notably something like Pope's Exorcist from last year with Russell Crowe. This movie, like a lot of religious horror flicks, centers on a character named Margaret, played by Nell Free, who is being transferred from the United States of America and the church there to come now to Rome and work in the church there, most notably in their orphanage. So right out of the gate, that's something we've seen before, right? Somebody being transferred from one side of the church to another in a different country or a different area from where they live. They come in, they start to discover there's some ritualistic, creepy, evil stuff going on underground within this church, and then they have to try to do whatever they can to try to stop said evil story. And that's literally the basic gist of this movie. Of course, it is a prequel to the original Omen, so in a lot of ways this is a tee up and a setup for the events of the original Omen, not the remake. And so I was intrigued to see how it would end and where it would go. And with that said, there are plenty of homages and references and even moments that are recreated from other Omen films, so it definitely feels like a love letter to the franchise, as well as something that felt like, hey, let's have some fun by recreating iconic scenes from those previous films. If you've seen those films, and you'll know what those moments are. If you haven't seen those films, then of course they're just going to seem like random moments in this movie. And so yeah, pretty much our main character Margaret just gets herself involved here. She's coming to become a sister now in this church in Rome, and of course work in the orphanage. She ends up discovering there's a young girl named Carlita who's really troubled, and the people treat her very differently, and she starts to uncover why as time goes on. And as she starts to kind of dig deeper into this church, she starts to discover a very dark secret that's beneath all of this, some intentions to bring people to Christ through a very evil way. And in a lot of ways, like I said, it's something you've seen before. There's nothing about this film that felt wholly original. But to start off with big positives, I'll say the performances were pretty fantastic here, with our main lead, Nell Free, being the absolute standout. I'd actually never seen her in anything, and I was looking through her IMDb to see if I'd seen her in anything. I know she was in Game of Thrones and some other things. I actually have never seen Game of Thrones. I know, people tell me all the time I'm crazy for that. But she's been in a couple of things that I've just never seen, so this was my introduction to her, and I thought she was phenomenal in this film, giving a really grounded and believable performance. I thought she was great in the role. You could definitely feel her fear and her tension in a lot of these big moments as she's going through some pretty scary moments of hallucinations, as well as uncovering some pretty creepy things that she kind of has to keep herself kind of hush-lipped about a lot of those things. And I think for the most part, she kind of is able to act out all of those things so beautifully in small moments of nuance without having to really give a lot of dialogue, even though she does have a lot of dialogue in the film. And outside of that, honestly, I found the costume design to be fantastic. Of course, they utilized a lot of practical locations, and creepy church locations are always going to be something that suits the horror genre, so this film is no different. It's very well shot. There's some great cinematography throughout the course of the film, and a really eerie musical score that uses a lot of vocalization to kind of emphasize that creepy eeriness. Throughout the course of the film, there's a couple of jump scares, one of which that did get me, mainly just because it was very loud. I saw all the jump scares coming from a mile away. There was nothing about them that was not already televised for you to know that they were coming, but I was definitely still jumping at a couple of moments because of the loud noise. It's got the classic jump scare thing throughout the course of the film. Outside of that, the film isn't really necessarily scary or eerie. There wasn't anything that ever really fully creeped me out as a longtime horror fan, but I can see that this film may creep out some people who are not so in-depth into the horror film, most notably some younger people who are starting to get into horror these days. As a prequel to Omen, it's fine. It really isn't until the last 20 minutes or so that it really starts to connect itself far more to the events of the original Omen film, and I would say most notably in the last 10 minutes or so, with most of this film kind of being its own standalone thing. In a lot of ways, this could have just been another religious horror flick that did not need the connection to an iconic franchise, but you know, we've seen this time and time again. You put an iconic franchise's name in the title, and of course it's going to be something that draws more people in, or at least that's what they hope. But beyond all the positives that I've spoken about in terms of the technical elements, the performances, the look, the feel, the vibe of the film, all that stuff was really solid. Unfortunately, this movie just slides into a very generic file of movies we've seen time in and time out. And while some of it was interesting, I think because of the fact that we've seen these kind of films so many times, there was nothing about it that really innovated it. And I got to see it in a press screening with myself and only press and media individuals, no public screening. And so getting to talk to some of the other individuals who were there to review the film as well, there were a couple of people that were into it, but most notably, I've spoken to most people in there that said that they were just kind of like about it, or some people were saying they were struggling to keep their eyes open, and I kind of have to echo that. I was watching the movie just fine. I never fell asleep or anything like that, but my eyelids were feeling super, super heavy as I was watching the movie, and I was worried that maybe I was just tired for the day, but right after I went and watched Monkey Man, literally did a double feature back to back, and in no way, shape, or form were my eyelids ever heavy during Monkey Man. So I think when I think about First Omen, it was just a little bit dull, a little bit redundant for this style of movie at this point. And like I said, just a few weeks ago, like a month and some change ago, we got Immaculate with Sydney Sweeney. Again, I haven't seen that film, but I know both films center on evil pregnancy and a young individual who's kind of being brought into this church only to discover there's something going on under the surface. And it just feels like we're getting so many of these kinds of movies. I brought up Pope's Exorcist from last year, and there's just so many others from previous years, previous decades, whatever the case may be. There's nothing about this film that ever really changes the landscape of horror religious films. It does exactly what you would expect it to do. Again, it is impressive when it comes down to the performances and the technical aspects. There are some nice gross out creep factors here. There's a moment specifically with a pregnancy and a birth giving that is pretty gnarly and really gross and gory and grimy, and they show it really up close. So there is some stuff that may make some people who are a bit squeamish kind of, shriek a little bit in their seat or cringe a little bit. But for me, as somebody who's a seasoned horror fan who likes to see really good practical effects and these kind of things, while I was impressed, I ultimately never found myself fully connected to the narrative, the characters, and what was going on, and it just felt like more of the same. And I just honestly felt like most of the film was relegated to a lot of exposition, more so than actual genuine scares. And by the time the movie came to an end and connected itself to the original Omen film, it just felt, again, like another religious horror flick, and that's all I really have to say on the first Omen. So I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say. Are you planning on checking this movie out? And if you already checked it out and that's what brought you to this review, did you like it? Did you not like it? Did you feel it needed to be connected to the Omen franchise at all? Or is this maybe your favorite Omen film altogether? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.